So today our group will discuss about the understanding meat and cuts or game. Next slide. In our topic, the objectives here is to describe the composition and structure of the meat, explain the use of the federal meat inspection and grading system, uh, explain explain the effect that aging has on meat, and identify the primary methods of it. Next is identify the primal cuts of beef, lamb, veal, and pork. Next is select the appropriate cooking methods for the most important meat cuts. Next is the prepare variety meats. And next will be the identify the characteristics of game meats and select the appropriate cooking methods for them. And determine the doneness in cooked meat. And lastly is the storage or in storing the fresh meat and frozen meat to gain the maximum shelf life. So what is meat? Meat is a muscle tissue and is the flesh of domestic animals such as cattle, hogs, and lambs, and wild game animals, also known as the deer. And the meat is the largest expense item of food service in the world. Next, please. So my topic will cover up the composition, the structure, the inspection and grading, and aging. First, I'm going to discuss the composition. So the composition has four, four, three major components of muscle tissue. First is water. The water has the upwards of 75% and with a high percentage of water in muscle tissue. And it with the high percentage of water in muscle tissue, it explains the challenge of shrinkage during cooking. Next is the excessive moisture loss during cooking. These are the dry meat, loss of product weight, and loss of product profit. Second component is the protein, which it has about 20%, and it is the most abundant solid material of meat itself. And the muscle tissue becomes firmer and loses moisture as it coagulates. And doneness, doneness is related to the desired degree of muscle protein coagulation. And if there is an excessive coagulation, it will result in a toughening of the proteins and moisture loss. Next, please. The third composition is the fat. In the muscle tissue, it has a 5% amount and as much as 30% of carcass. And it has the surface fat retain moisture during cooking. In addition to the first sentence that I've explained is that uh, it is an important nutrient because it is the most abundant solid material of the meat itself because because of the health and dietary concerns which many meat animals are being bred and raised with lowered fat content, and there's also certain amount of fat is needed for three reasons. First reason is the juiciness. For the juiciness, through marbling, where fat is deposited within the muscle tissue, making the fat uh, making the fat tastier than its moisture. Next is the tenderness. For the tenderness, it is where marbling is separated from the muscle fiber, making them easier to chew. And lastly is the flavor. In here, fat is considered to be the main source of flavor that gives a bountiful appetite and taste. Next, please. And the last composition is the carbohydrate. Carbohydrate. So every meat contains a small amount of carbohydrates, also for the fruits as well. So it plays a huge part in a complex reaction, also called the Maillard reaction. So Maillard reaction means that which in which meats are browned by roasting, broiling, and sautéing. And in addition, the presence of carbohydrates resulting could be the resulting in on the desirable flavor and the appearance of brown meat. So the next components that the next uh, topic that we'll tackle is the muscle fiber. The muscle fiber is composed of long thin muscle fibers bound in the bundles. So there are so in so it also determines the in order to determines the meat's texture or grain. There are two examples of it. First is the fine grained meat, which it has the small fibers bound in small bundles. Next is the coarse textured meat, that has also it has also large muscle fibers. The next structure would be the connective tissue. That connective tissue binds muscle fibers together. So below are what it what does a connective tissue means. First is are the highest in connective tissue. Example, they come from the muscles that are more exercised. For instance, the muscles in the legs that have more connective tissues than muscles in the back. Second is they come from older animals which our meat is more tender than young steer, for instance, old bull and cow. And there are other animals also when their tissues become harder to break down for some. Next is the meats in high connective tissue can be made tenderer by using proper cooking techniques. These are the two proper cooking techniques from how to make the connective tissue more tenderer. First is collagen. The collagen are broken down by heat, acids, enzymes, and tenderizers. In here, it is when cooked in moist heat, the collagen softens and turns into gelatin. It is also a thin, white, transparent connective tissue found in the tendons, between muscle cells, and between muscles. The next is the elastin. Elastin must be physically removed or broken down mechanically. In here, it cannot be softened by heat. Excuse. In here, it cannot be softened by heat and is usually cut away before cooking. It is also to tenderize the meat, and it must be pound, cut, or grind. Next. So I'm going to talk about the inspection and grading. So for the inspection, it is guaranteed that of wholesomeness indicated with a round stamp. Here, this one. So all the meat for public consumption must be inspected by the United States Department of Agriculture, or also known as the USDA, and Food and Drug Administration for the Philippines. And the Federal Meat Inspection Act requires that all meat shipped across state lines to be inspected in order to ensure that the products are processed under strict sanitary guidelines and products are wholesomeness and fit for human consumption before and after they are slaughtered. So the inspection of meat should be mandatory and is graded according to the standards that include the amount of meat on the animal, the amount of marbling, the age of the animal, and the texture and the appearance of the meat. Next, please. So there are two types of grading the meat. First is the quality grading. The quality grading is the quality designation is indicated by a shield stamp and based on texture, firmness, color of lean meat, age or maturity, and marbling. And it is not required by US law which means it is just a voluntary. And the next grading will be the yield grading. The yield grading is graded according to how much usable meat in proportion to the fat they have. And lastly is the amount of edible meat to bone and fat ratio. Next. So in here you can see this how the USDA grade their meats accordingly. So the grade is stamped on the meat, both grade and inspection marks. Inspection marks Inspection marks are stamped with harmless vegetable dye. And lamb, veal, and beef are graded with some grades, with the one exception. So the good here is the veal and lamb, which are the same as they have the select for the beef. And the pork is not graded because the meat is more uniform and consistent in quality. Then the beef here is prime, which is the highest and most expensive grade because the meat is well marbled, tender, and flavorful. In addition, marbling marbling in meat is valued because of added flavor to it, and also select has the less amount of marbling and less expensive. Next, please. And the last topic that I'm going to discuss is aging. So it has two components. First is the green meat. The green meat is when animals are slaughtered and their muscles are soft and flabby. Then within 6 to 24 hours, rigor mortis sets in, causing the muscle to contract and stiffen. Then lastly is the rigor mortis dissipates in 48 to 72 hours while under refrigeration. And all meats are allowed to age or rest long enough for the rigor mortis to dissipate. And the next will be the aged meat. For the aged meat is aging is done to bring out the texture and flavor characteristics of the meat. So in addition, aging doesn't only mean that meat must be stored in the refrigerator all the time. Thus, there are conditions where we should carefully control the temperature and shelf life of the meat so that to maintain its tenderness without spoilage. Next is these are the following methods in for the aged meat, and there are two there are two methods of it. First is the wet aging, which it has smaller cuts of meat that are enclosed in a cryovac air or the plastic vacuum packs and moisture-proof packaging. Second is it protects from bacteria and mold. And lastly, it prevents weight loss from drying. And the second method is the dry aging. It is the larger cuts of meat are exposed to air in controlled conditions and can lose up to 20% of weight. And lastly, it is more expensive than wet aging. That's all, and thank you.
Okay. So next topic is the understanding the basic cuts. Under the basic understanding the basic cuts, there are 5 topics. A is the available forms, which are the carcasses, partial carcasses, the primals, and fabricated cuts. Letter B is the bone structure. C is the beef, lamb, veal, and pork cuts. D is the selecting meats for your operation, and letter E is the fabricating meat. So, understanding the different cuts of meat is that the key to understanding them is the meat is to where is the animal from, where a certain piece of meat is to be understood where the muscle and the different muscles are used in different things in the body. One of the most important principles of understanding meat is the muscles that work more in the animal, which are tougher than those that are used less. So in general, These parts of the animal that work the most are the shoulders, the neck, and legs. The parts of the animal that work less are found in the back and especially toward and including the small of the back, which is where we get the T-bone and the porterhouse steaks from. So next is the meat cuts are based on two factors, the muscle and bone structure of the meat, and second is the uses of and appropriate cooking methods for various parts of the animal. So the meat muscle, which is what we eat, is made of fibers and which is bound together with the connective tissue that are mainly linked to the other groups of muscles or directly to the animal's bone structure. In the second sentence, it is important to select the proper cooking method for the cut of meat. The less tender cuts of meat require moist heat cooking methods to help break down the tough connective tissues. Moist heat cooking means moisture is added to the meat, which the meat is cooked slowly over a longer period of time. Then, next is the available forms of the meat, which is the carcasses, partial carcasses, the primals, and the fabricated cuts. The carcasses is the whole of the animal, minus the entrails, the head, the feet, and the hide. The hide is a natural part of the meat production, where they can be tanned and made into a wide variety of products. Many local breeds have hides with attractive or unusual colors and patterns, making them ideal for production and distinctive leather for handicrafts. So next is the except for pork, from which only the entrails and heads are removed. Then, whole carcasses are rarely purchased by food service operators because of the skill and labor required in cutting and because of the problem of total utilization. So, the next is the sides, quarters, fore saddles, hind saddles. So this represents the first step in breaking down a carcass. Again, these larger cuts are no longer frequently used in the food service. Fewer establishments cut their own meats. So the first step is the beef is split first to the backbone in two sides. Sides are divided between the 12th and 13th ribs into forequarter and hindquarter. Second is the veal and lamb, which are not split into sides but are divided into half into fore saddle and hind saddle. For veal, the cut is made between the 11th and 12th ribs. Lamb, on the other hand, is split either between the 12th and 13th rib or after the 13th rib, depending on the cutting style. So the third is the pork carcasses are not divided in this way. They are cut directly into the primal cuts. Next is the primal or wholesale cuts. These are the primary divisions of the quarters, the fore saddles, hind saddles, and carcasses. These cuts, called primal cuts, are still used to some extent in the food service because of first, they are small enough to be manageable in many food service kitchens. Second is that they are still large enough to allow a variety of cuts for different uses or needs. The third is that they are easier to utilize completely than quarters or halves. Next is the fabricated cuts, primal cuts, which is the fabricated into smaller cuts for roast, steaks, chops, cutlets, stewing meat, ground meat, and so forth. According to individual customer requirements and if applicable, IMPS or NAMP specifications. Then the portion controlled cuts, which are the ready to cook meats cut according to customer specification. Steaks and chops are ordered either by weight per steak or by thickness. Portion controlled cuts require the least work for the cook of all meat cuts. They are also most expensive per pound of all categories of cuts, as they are selected specifically because of the portion controlled. Next is the Bone structure, which first identifies the meat cuts. The distinctive shapes of the bones are often the best clue to the identification of a cut. So, how the shapes of the bone in the photographs help would help you to recognize later on. So, second is the boning and cutting meats. Bones are often surrounded by flesh. You need to know where they are even if you can't see them. Third is the carving cooked meats, which is same as the reason for number 2. Then here in this slide, here are the beef cuts, which has two features, which is the primal beef meat cuts and the letter B, which is the primal wholesale beef cuts and their bone structure. As you can see, there you there is the chuck square cut, the rib, the short loin, the full loin, and the sirloin. The round, the flank, the short plate, please, the short plate, then the brisket, and the shank. Next is as next in this slide, as you can see, there is you can see a further in-depth picture of each cut of the meat, where you can see the beef chuck boneless, which is separated into three, which is the blade, the clod, and the arm. The beef rib roast, which roast ready. The beef rib steak, as most steaks are as to be seen, and the beef loin, the beef short loin, the beef porterhouse steak, the beef tenderloin trimmed, the beef T-bone steak, the beef strip loin, the beef outside bottom round, beef round steak, the beef flank steak, the beef shank cross cuts, the beef knuckle untrimmed, and the beef inside the top or the top round. Next is the veal, the primal veal meat cuts and the primal veal cuts and their bone structure. So under the veal meat cuts and through their bone structure, you can see the neck, the shoulder, the hotel rack, the loin trimmed, the sirloin, of the leg sirloin on, the flank, the breast, and the shank. So you may be asking that what's the difference of the veal and the beef? The difference between the beef and the veal is that beef is from the older cattle, whereas veal is the meat of the younger cattle. Well, veal is slightly more tender than beef, due to the muscles not being worked for as long as the muscles of beef, and it has a much more delicate flavor. Next is the primal lamb meat cuts and its bone structure. You can see through the lamb meat cuts and their structure, they will have a lamb. They will have the neck, the shoulder, the shank, the breast, the sirloin, the leg, the sirloin of the loin, and the hotel rack. Under the lamb, you can see different meats, which is the lamb loin roast, the lamb arm chop, the lamb shoulder blade chop, the lamb rib chop, the lamb loin chop, the lamb foreshank, the lamb boneless shoulder rolled and tied, lamb whole leg, and the lamb square cut or the shoulder whole. Next is the pork's meat cuts and its bone structure, which under it you can have the full pork loin or the included ribs, the pork tenderloin, the pork shoulder butt, and the pork loin chops, the pork rib half and loin half roast. Next, you can see here is the full bone structure of a beef, which consists of the neck bone in the top part, the backbone, the tailbone, the blade bone, arm bone, and so on. So in the meat cutting terminology, although the public refers to retail meat cutters as butchers, the meat industry uses this term another way. These terms can be the butcher, the fabricate, and carve. Butcher, which means to kill and dress a meat animal. A fabricate, which means to cut raw meat into smaller pieces. And the third term, which is the carve, also means to cut meat, but this always refers to cooked meat. The next is the beef, lamb, veal, and pork cuts. Now you can see here the different parts of the meat cuts, and here is its major bones component, the common fabricated cuts, and the primary cooking methods, which consist the chuck consists of ribs 1 to 5, blade bone, backbone, including chine and feather bones, neck bones, arm bones. The shoulder clawed, triangle, boneless inside chuck, the chuck tender, chuck short ribs, cube steaks, stew meat, ground chuck, which is cooked moist in a moist heat. The brisket part, which consists of the bones of rib cartilage, breastbone, and under the common fabricated cuts is the boneless brisket and corned beef brisket, the ground beef, the moist heat, the shank, which is located under the brisket, then the rib is located near the chuck part of the beef, the short plate, which is located near short plate near under the rib, and next is and note that the finger bones are the short horizontal bones attached to those chine bones that have no ribs attached. So they are stems of the teeth in T-bones. So here are other parts of the beef, which is the full loin, the short loin, the sirloin, the flank, and the round. And you can see the major bones. They have the common fabricated cuts, then the primary cooking method, which is mostly dry heat. Next part of the cuts of the meats are through a lamb. So the lamb prima cuts and its fabricated cuts. So there are two cutting styles for lamb carcasses. In style A, the carcass is divided between the fourth and fifth ribs, and again between the 12th and 13th ribs. In style B, the cuts are made between the fifth and sixth ribs, and again behind the 13th rib. Both styles yield 8 rib racks. Style B produces a rack with more uniform eye muscle through the length of the rack. Under the lamb prima cuts, you can see the shoulder, breast, and shank, the hotel rack, and the loin, the leg. Through this, you can see the major bones, the common fabricated cuts, the primary cooking methods, which is moist heat to dry heat. The next is the cuts, veal cuts. Under where the veal cuts is that the shoulder may be separated from the rack between the fourth and fifth ribs to yield a 7-rib rack, or between the fifth and sixth ribs to yield a 6-rib rack. Under the veal ribs, you can have the shoulder, the breast, the shank hotel rack, the loin, the leg, where you can see the major bones, the common fabricated cuts, and the primary cooking method, which consists of the moist heat and dry heat method as well. Then lastly, the pork cuts of the meats is the pork has more than 13 ribs, unlike beef, lamb, and veal, due to the special breeding to develop long loins. So they have more ribs than beef because they expand more than the beef, lamb, and the veal. So under the pork cuts is the shoulder picnic, the Boston butt, the loin, the ham, the belly spare ribs, the fat back and clear palate, the jowl, and the feet. The you can see there also the major bones that they have. The common fabricated cuts, which are the different cuts you can have under these meats. Then the primary cooking methods, which is also through the moist heat and dry heat, and also for through their fats you can use them for cooking. So that is all.
So in continuation of what Mika discussed, our next topic will be selecting meats for your operation. When you are selecting meats for your operation, you should never buy meat that's past the expiration or sell by date. Also, buy meats at the store after you found all other items to decrease the time the meat is out of refrigeration. Deciding which forms to purchase. How much meat cutting skill you or your staff has. How much work and storage space you have. Whether or not you can use all cuts and lean trim on your menu. Which form gives you the best cost per portion after figuring in labor cost. These are the specifications when buying meat. You must indicate the following specifications. Number 1, the item name. 2, grade, example, or US choice. 3, weight range for roast and large cuts. Portion weight or thickness for steaks and chops. Number 4, state of refrigeration, chilled or frozen. Number 5, fat limitations or average thickness of surface fat. Next is meat purchasers may also have to choose whether or not to purchase irradiated meat. Irradiation is the process of exposing foods to radiation in order to kill bacteria, parasites, and other potentially harmful organisms. Irradiation does not harm the meat, make it radioactive, or change its structure, flavor, or nutritional value. Foods treated with radiation must be labeled as such. Some operations refuse to purchase irradiated foods because they or their customers have concerns about their health effects. The procedure has generated much controversy for other reasons as well. Next, please. Fabricating meat. Um, Next, please. One term you will never encounter often when trimming meat is silver skin, a thin layer or membrane of connective tissue that often covers the surface of a muscle. For braised meats, it is not always necessary to remove silver skin unless it is very heavy because slow cooking breaks down the collagen of the tissue. However, for roast, sautés, and grills of tender meats, it should be removed for two reasons. Number one, it is tough and would be unpleasantly chewy in the cooked product. Number two, it usually shrinks when cooked, making the meat deform or curl. To remove the silver skin, you need to hold the blade of the knife parallel to the silver skin and perpendicular to the grain of the meat. Insert the tip of the blade just under the silver skin. Hold the knife so the edge of the blade angles slightly upward. Carefully slip the blade under the silver skin in the direction of the meat, while holding the meat steady with your other hand. Repeat until all silver skin is removed. Next, please. Now for preparing beef tenderloin. You need to have a whole untrimmed beef tenderloin. Next, pull off the heavy fat from the outside of the tenderloin, freeing it with a knife as necessary. Separate the strip of grizzly meat or chain from the side of the tenderloin. Use this piece for ground meat. Carefully the remove the silver skin. Next, the fully trimmed tenderloin before cutting. Cut into steaks. This tenderloin has been cut into a variety of steaks as a demonstration. From left to right, 4 fillet steaks, 2 large pieces of Chateaubriand, 2 tornadoes, 4 filet mignons in front, trimmings from both ends. Next, please. Now for preparing a leg of lamb for roasting. First, begin with removing the hip and tail bones. Next, with a sharp, pointed boning knife, cut along the hip bone to separate bone from meat. Always cut against the bone. Next, continue until the hip bone and tail bone are completely removed. Note that the hip bone and tail bone should be removed before cutting the leg. Now for preparing a leg of lamb for roasting. First, trim off excess external fat, leaving a thin covering. Pull off the skin or fell on the outside of the leg. Full leg of lamb ready for roasting. The end, the shank bone, and part of the shank meat have been removed. Next, the leg may be tied into a more compact shape. Next, the sirloin portion may be cut off and used for another purpose, such as shish kebabs. Next, for preparing a rack of lamb for roasting. Begin by cutting down on both sides the feather bones all the way to the chin bone. Next, if a meat saw is available, turn the rack over and cut through the rib bones where they attach to the chin bone. Next, if a meat saw is not available, use a clever stand, the roast on end, and cut through the rib bones where they join the chin bone. This separates one rack. Next, repeat the procedure on the other side of the chin. Next, the two halves are separated from the chin. Last, trim excess fat from the top of the meat, leaving a thin protective covering. During this step, you should also remove the shoulder blade cartilage, which is embedded in the layers of fat. Next, please. Line down to the bone, keeping the cut about 1 inch from the tip of the eye muscle. Next, score the membrane covering the rib bones. Pull and cut the layer of fat from the bones. Next, the roast is trimmed and ready to cook. For butterflying and stuffing a pork loin. First, to butterfly, hold the knife blade parallel to the table and cut through the center of the loin as shown. Do not cut all the way through, but leave the meat attached at one edge. Next, open the cut meat and spread the filling on the bottom half. Next, fold the top half over the filling to reform the loin. Next please. Tying a roast. First, to tie a length of butcher's twine tightly around one end of the roast. After tying the knot securely, twist the length of twine into a loop as shown. Next, pass the loop over the end of the roast. Next, position the loop an inch or two from the first loop and pull the loose end to tighten. Continue making loops and tightening them until the whole length of meat is tied. Turn the meat upside down past the loose end of the twine under the last loop and wind it once around as shown. Repeat step E with each of the loops when you reach the end of the roast. Tie it off securely to the short length of twine from the knot made in the first step. Next, trimming, cutting, and pounding veal for scalloping. Remove all tendons and connective tissue from the veal. Slip the point of a thin boning knife under the skin. Angle the edge of the blade upward against the skin and cut it away carefully without cutting through the meat. Next, holding the blade of the knife at an angle, if necessary, to get broader slice. Cut across the grain of the meat as shown to make thin slices. Next, broader slices can be cut from narrower pieces of meat by butterflying. Cut the slice almost through the meat but leave it attached. Then cut the second slice the same way but cut all the way through. A butterfly half-wing is twice as large as a single slice. Unfortunately, it has a seam in the center that often detracts from the appearance of the finished dish, unless the veal is breaded or covered with a topping. If desired, pound the cutlet to an even thickness with a cutlet mallet. This helps disguise the seam in a butterfly cutlet. Next, please. Next, the trimming of pork tenderloin. For stuffed pork chops, cut a pocket in the chops as shown. For larding meat, using larding needle, cut a strip of fat back to fit inside the needle. Insert the needle through the meat. Pull out the needle, holding strip of fat so it stays inside the meat. And shaping medallions. Next. That's all. Thank you.
Cooking and handling meat. Next slide, please. Principles of low heat cooking. High heat cooking softens and shrinks protein, resulting in excessive moisture loss. Roast cooked at lower temperature have better yield. Moist heat penetrates quickly, became liquid, and steam are better conduction than air. Next slide, please. Breaking down connective tissues. Rib and loin cut. Rib and loin cut are always the most tender cut, used mostly for steaks and chops. For the leg and round, for beef, beef is most suitable for racing. For veal, lamb, and pork, these meats are younger animals, therefore tender enough to roast. Next slide. upper shoulder. For the beef is most suitable for braising. For the veal, lamb, and pork, these meats are often braised but are young enough to roast or cut into chops for broiling. For shanks, breast, brisket, and flank, the beef uh, can be broiled if cooked rare or sliced thin. Veal, lamb, and pork, these meats are most often braised. Next slide, please. Fat content. Par- Parding is trying to slice off fat over the surface of meat to protect them while roasting. Larding insert strips of fat with a larding needle into meats low in marbling. Next slide, please. Tenderness is not only the goal for cooking. Other other goals include develop flavor, prevent excessive shrinkage, and develop the appearance. Next slide. For searing and sealing. Searing meats are at high heat creates desirable flavor and color by browning all sides. Blanching meats in boiling water leads to some protein co- coagulation. Not much protein is carried out of the meat with lost moisture. For cooking frozen meat, meats cooked from the frozen state lose no moisture through defrosting, but loses moisture during cooking. Cooking frozen meats complicates the cooking process. For doneness, dry heat dry heat cooking, there there is rare, medium, and well done. For rare, a rare meat is brown has brown surfaces, thin layers of gray, and a red interior. Medium has thick layer of gray and pink interior. For well done, it is gray throughout. The, the, the touches of rare feels soft. For medium feels moderately firm, and for well done feels firm. Moist heat cooking. Doneness is indicated by tenderness, not by temperature. Most of the time, the meat is well done. For juiciness, three main factors of juiciness: internal fat, gelatin, and protein coagulation. Carryover cooking is the internal temperature continues to rise after the meat is removed from the oven. Next slide, please. Variety meats include organs, glands, and other meats that don't form a part of the dressed carcass of the animal. Examples of these are liver, kidneys, sweetbreads, brains, heart, tongue, oxtails, and tripe. Other varieties include intestines and caul. Next. For game is used to refer to poultry and meat animals normally found in the wild, such as venison, boar, buffalo or American bison, rabbit, or hare. For fresh meats, the fresh meat should be stored at 32 degrees Fahrenheit to 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Allow proper air circulation. Do not open uh, vacuum package meats until ready to use. Keep the meats separate in the cooler or avoid cross-contamination. Use as quickly as possible because fresh meats keep well for only 2 to 4 days. For frozen meats should be stored at 0 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. Wrap frozen meats well to prevent freezer burn. Recommended shelf life of a frozen meat at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. For beef, veal, and lamb, its shelf life is 6 months. For pork, it is 4 months. Defrost carefully in the refrigerator. Do not refreeze thawed meat.